want to circle back to the CARES Act and talk a little more in depth about details related to the revenue, to applying for reimbursement, and then to try to answer many of the questions that we've received in the last week. It seems like it's been much longer than a week, but it hasn't. It was a week ago today that State Finance Director Kelly Butler joined us on the webinar, announced the eligibility maximums for each county. Since then, of course, you've received the reimbursement information, and we're going to focus much of our discussion on that today as the reimbursement process is, I guess, has officially begun. But I wanted to offer you a couple of considerations that we hope you will keep in mind as we move forward. There are at least 3 pots of money that are out there for counties to access right now, and we believe that it's important because we are still early in this process, early in the response, and certainly very early in the reimbursement process. We believe that it's important for you to try to protect the CARES amount, the money that was announced last Tuesday, the eligibility amount from the Coronavirus Relief Fund that was part of the CARES Act, that you at this point try to protect that revenue as much as possible. And you can do that by doing at least a couple of things that we're aware of. One of those would be anything that you have spent money on that is FEMA reimbursable, for pushing those reimbursement requests into that column and submitting those through the FEMA process. Now, again, that's only 75% reimbursement. There is a 25% match, but the CARES Act funding may be used to pay the match. So rather than submitting things like PPE and other expenses that are eligible through the FEMA process, rather than pushing those through the CARES Act, we ask you and encourage you to strongly look at using the FEMA process and only therefore expending 25% of the CARES money on those expenses. Election expenses, both for the upcoming primary and the general election. Remember, we had David Brewer from the Secretary of State's office on, I think maybe 3 weeks ago, to talk to you about the election reimbursement process. That also came out of the CARES Act. The state of Alabama, with the match that is being paid by the state, has more than $8 million available for reimbursement there. And we again would encourage you to push those election expenses into that column, and then therefore what should result is that your Coronavirus Relief Fund money's being able to focus them on the other expenses that you have going forward. A number of you have contacted us as a staff and have said, we really don't have a lot of expenses now, man. This is a lot of money for us to have eligibility for when we really haven't had a significant amount of expenses up into this point. And 2 points I want to make about that. One is that the U.S. Treasury is providing guidance, not on a daily basis, but certainly every couple of weeks. That guidance on what is eligible and what is not eligible is likely to evolve. And because of that, again, we think it is prudent for us to protect this money and keep as much money in our pocket as we can, as much eligibility avenue available to us as we can. And then secondly, of course, we don't know where this virus is going to go. We don't know what's going to happen between now and December 30, which is the last day for which you can apply for reimbursement. And we think it is prudent for us to keep as much reimbursement eligibility available for us as possible. So we encourage you to take those things into account and consideration as you move forward in the coming days. Also want to take a quick look at the information that you received from the Finance Department. That information, of course, was pushed out after our webinar was concluded last week, and I am receiving a number of questions. Those of you who have submitted those, we will circle back and address those in just a moment. So the Finance Department information was sent to you on Friday. Our last webinar together was on Tuesday. So I do want to go back and go through the memo quickly from Kelly Butler and point out a few things. The memo was distributed on an email from us that included also the distribution of the reimbursement amounts as well as some details. First, I want to point out to you the section of it of the memo that does again put on paper that you can use this money, overlap it with other federal money, and that of course would be why we touch base with you about the use of the money as it relates to matching for FEMA. There are two forms that are required. We're going to look at both of those. One of those is an acknowledgement and certification form that we want to make sure you look at very close and keep in mind the details of that form, as well as the reimbursement form. Both of those were included in Kelly Butler's memo. Attachment A, which is the form that will be used to acknowledge and certify your receipt of the money, as well as your commitment to follow the regulations with the money. And the most significant provision we want to make sure that you look very closely at is a provision near the end, number 7, under the certifications. And that is that that you are certifying that you recognize that it will be your responsibility to pay any financial penalties or costs that are associated from any unauthorized expenditure, and that if the state is required to pay any penalties or costs, to pay any money back and pay any penalties as a result of expenditures on the reimbursable items that were submitted by you, you are agreeing to pay all of those costs back. So I want to take a minute and make sure, again, based on some calls that we received, that everybody recognizes that the federal response to this pandemic, the response to this crisis, is different than in previous decades when we've had these kinds of things occur before and local governments were given grants that could be then spent. This is a reimbursement program, which means, again, you're going to have to spend the money. You're going to have to spend the money on allowable. Jen, if you'll kind of go back a minute, hang right there. You have to spend the money on allowable expenses, and then you will be reimbursed, and then you will have to stand good for those submissions. So I just want to point that out because we didn't get the chance to talk about that in detail last week. Then advancing forward, there is a form to be used. One of the questions that we received is, should the submittal be in Excel or Word or PDF? This form can be filled out digitally. So I encourage you to use this form, and then the backup information. I think you should use that. Use the forms that you have, whether you're keeping that in Word or whether you're keeping it in Excel. The supporting documentation ought to be submitted in the easiest form, the way that you're keeping the records. But I do encourage you to use that form because it can be filled out. If you'll back up one section for me, Jen, there, the form, most of your cost, I believe, is going to fall for reimbursement either in payroll or other. And so, again, utilizing the forms that are provided to you will, I think will help make the reimbursement process go more quickly. All of the forms are eventually going to make their way to the comptroller that will review and process the forms. And the administration at this point is very confident, and they're also very committed to trying to turn the money around as quickly as possible. Included in the information that was provided by Kelly was an overview of some guidance from, or a link to guidance from the Department of Treasury, as well as some FAQs. And I want to look at the guidance quickly. Again, there are just a few things I want to point out to you to make sure that you look at these closely as we move forward. This is a reimbursable program again, and your expenses are reimbursable only if they meet the following 3 requirements. One is that the expenditures are necessary and that were incurred due to the public health emergency with respect to the coronavirus. They were necessary, and that'll be important in a minute. We'll talk about what the guidance says necessary is. Those expenses were not accounted for in the current budget, and the expenses were incurred between March 1 and December 30. It's important. We'll look at a moment at what is defined as incurred under the guidance is not exactly what we normally would consider incurred. First, looking at what is necessary, the guidance says that these expenditures are those that are incurred due to the health emergency, and that means that it's only those things that were taken to respond to the emergency, actions that were taken to respond to the emergency, such as things that were expenditures that were necessary to address medical or public health need, as well as expenditures incurred to respond to second order effects of the emergency by providing economic support. That's an issue that's a little more complicated in Alabama. In some states, the counties may be in a position to expend some of this money to help provide economic support to businesses. It's much more complicated here. We've talked about that on some previous webinars as well because of Amendment 772. We can focus on that with any of you who want to have specific conversations about that aspect and that reference here in this guidance. I would just say to you, in Alabama, providing that economic support is going to be very, very tricky, and we're very concerned about whether or not any of that could be reimbursable unless you followed the provisions of Amendment 772 very, very closely. The definition of necessary does not include shortfalls in governmental revenue. That has been a national discussion, but they're being able to come back and say, okay, gasoline tax, the increase in the gasoline and motor fuel tax was less than had been projected, so we want to claim that as a reimbursable expense right now. The guidance is very specific that does not apply. The statute also, necessary, doesn't mean, the term is broadly used to mean that the expenditure is reasonably necessary for its intended use. I highlight that for you near the bottom of the page to make sure that you understand that language really is going to put the onus back on us at audit time, and that is that the governing body itself is going to have to do some interpretation and evaluation. The state of Alabama will be looking at your applications as well, but the certification that you will sign will say that you are agreeing that even if the state of Alabama evaluates it, and even if the state of Alabama in that evaluation says okay and sends you a check, you agree to pay that money back with any penalties that might come if the federal government says the state of Alabama was wrong. So the first thing is it's necessary expenditures. Second is that it was something that was not accounted for in the budget. That's specific in the guidance, and we encourage you to look at that closely. But there are two tests. One is that the cost cannot lawfully be funded using a line item that's there, or that the cost is for a substantially different use than was anticipated in the line item. And then the third test, of course, is that that the expenditure occurred between March 1 and December 31. And again, what does incurred mean? I'll make sure that we touch this. Incurred, we might think that means you've signed a contract, you've approved a bid. The guidance says specifically that a cost is incurred when the responsible unit of government has expended the funds to cover the cost. So only the things that you have paid by December 30 will be eligible for reimbursement. The guidance also goes into some specific examples. We're not going to go through those. You can look at those yourself carefully. The guidance also lists some things that are absolutely not reimbursable as well, and we encourage you to look very, very closely at those. I'm going to take just a minute to look quickly at some FAQs that are, again, on the Department of Treasury's website page. There was a link provided by that was in the memo from Kelly, and that we also included in our memo, and we hope you've looked at these, but I want to flag a few of those as well, just so you hear us touch base on these. First question is, are governments required to submit proposed expenditures to Treasury for approval? The answer is no. Treasury's not going to approve your expenses. The government is responsible for making the determination about what expenditures are necessary to respond to the public health crisis. And the expenditures being necessary is a key as to whether or not the expenditures are reimbursable. So the very first thing on the FAQ is it's not the federal government's responsibility to tell you whether or not your expenses are allowable. Those are decisions you need to make, and those are decisions that will likely be subject to audit. There's a question about payroll expenses. I encourage you to look at this very, very closely. It does say that the local government may presume that payroll costs for public health and public safety employees are payments for services substantially dedicated to mitigating or responding to COVID and therefore would be reimbursable. Those expenses that were not budgeted and those expenses that were not anticipated for public health employees would be something that could be reimbursable for those who have those, as well as public safety employees. Overtime is an eligible expense. The regular salary of your public safety employees would not be an eligible expense. The guidance also says it has to be something that was not accounted for in the budget, and what would qualify as a substantial different use, therefore being something that was not budgeted for. The guidance gives us some help here that cost incurred for substantially different uses of line items would include, but not necessarily limited to, the following: cost of personnel and services that were budgeted in the approved budget, but which due to COVID had to be diverted to a substantially different function. So if you had money, let's say you were going to use to hire an assistant administrator, and instead of hiring an assistant administrator, you had to hire 3 people to come in and be in charge of security at the department. That would be in the courthouse. That would be diverting money to a substantially different function. Even though that money's in the budget itself, you moved it to a substantially different function, so it would be eligible for reimbursement. Even though it was in the budget, you diverted it to something else. And I think that's a distinction that you need to look at very, very closely. At the bottom of the page, I didn't highlight it. There is a direct statement that going home to telework is not a substantially different function. So you wouldn't be able to cover the salary of employees that worked from home. You would be able to cover expenses that you had in terms of making telework available or possible, but not the salary of those that teleworked. Is a fund payment recipient allowed to transfer funding to another governmental entity? The answer is yes. Are we required to? The answer is no. Do we need to in Alabama? The answer is no. The cities all receive their own direct eligibility amounts except in Jefferson County. So we're not required to. We are allowed to transfer. There's really no reason for us to do that in Alabama. The cities have their own eligibility, and I wanted to make sure that everybody knew that. There's $250 million that the legislature approved for cities and counties. Counties received $125 in eligibility. The cities received $125 million in eligibility as well. We've had this question as well, and that is, may recipients provide stipend to employees for eligible expenses? Things that employees might had to have done at their home, those kinds of things. The answer is absolutely not. You can reimburse employees for expenses that were deemed necessary, and that reimbursement is something you could apply for. But in terms of being able to advance money to employees, that is not something that we can do. I did miss at the top. I wanted to point out that should you end up having increased costs for unemployment benefit payments that are made out, that those are eligible for consideration for reimbursement. Continuing on to page 6, This is a question that a couple of you have asked, and that is, can the fund payments be used for capital improvements for projects that broadly provide prudential economic development in a community? The answer is no. These capital improvements, actually, the guidance says in general no. Capital improvement projects that are not necessary expenditures incurred due to COVID would not therefore be reimbursable. There are some things that you might do of a capital nature that would be reimbursable. Improvements you had to make, let's say on the jail, to be able to quarantine, to set up an outside facility. I know a number of counties did that, to hold prisoners there until they could be tested before they came into the general population. Those things would all be eligible for consideration, and encourage you to look very, very closely at that. Hazardous pay, we've had a number of calls about that. The FAQ addresses that directly. Could you provide hazardous pay for everyone? The answer is really no. It kind of in a backward way. Here it addresses that the hazardous pay involves those who had a physical hardship that is directly related to COVID response. And we encourage you again to look very, very closely and judiciously at any hazardous duty pay that you do pay. May counties prepay expenses? Obviously, the answer is no. This is a reimbursement program. You couldn't lease something for 24 months and try to submit that entire lease beyond the December 30 deadline. Jump into page 7. A couple of other questions here real quickly before we conclude that I want to touch base on for you. Can you pay all employees across the board for hazardous duty pay? This guidance doesn't say in general no. The guidance says no. That paying all of your employees who continue to work hazardous duty pay is not reimbursable from this money, and we want to make sure that everyone has looked at that. On the next page, there's a question about can this money be used to prepare for future COVID outbreaks? Again, fund payments may be used only for expenditures to address the current public health emergency, and I think that'll be important for you as you go forwards. At the bottom of page 8, kind of in conclusion, and looking at the current FAQs that are available, a number of you have asked, what if we use this money to purchase items that we need to respond? Are we able to continue to use those items after this public health emergency is behind us? And the answer is yes. If the purchase of the item qualified, then once we get to December 30, you don't have to stop using it. You can continue to use it going forward, and that may be very important for some of you in evaluating maybe how you want to respond to needs that you might have.